All right, hello, welcome. This is a sort of impromptu, informal stream where Being's going to go over the basics of political ideologies. Being is here with Piper Tompkins, expert on world systems theory, expert on socialism. Being also has Alternative Tomorrow, expert on what are you an expert on? Alternative Tomorrow. Okay, you're an expert on stage fright. I got it. Gotcha. We I don't know if are you trying to talk right now?
I'm so sorry. I meant to say I'm
Oh,
I'm an expert on Marxist humanism and Hegel.
what would you say you're also you're an expert on conservatism?
Well, yes, I actually
All right.
I read a lot of conservative theory.
Yes, and by expert being means we've read a bunch of books from academics, you know. Uh all right. So there's timestamps below from when we start to get into the definition for political ideology and also the definitions for individual ideologies as we go on. So those are timestamps if you want to just skip this and get right into it. Okay. Being's Political Ideology 101. What is a political ideology? Ideological spectrum, four genera, and 8 subgenera. All right. Introduction. The point of this 101 will be to try and explain very contentious and complex concepts in political science. However, some details are important to go through before we get right into a definition of political ideology. Many of the definitions and concepts used here are reflective of Being's and Being's many helpful friends' work in researching these topics. So, this isn't meant to represent an official academic or college course. Instead, it represents Being's own thoughts on this topic as influenced by Roger Griffin, Christopher Flood, Benedict Anderson, Cass Maud, and Emmanuel Wallerstein. It's very possible there will be many grammatical mistakes as we go on. Human languages are not easy to understand for an alien like being. The goal of this is to try and provide people with some useful tools for understanding political ideology and many of its manifestations. And since this is going to be more informal, there's going to be a lot of vocal mess ups and ums and ahs. So, okay. All right. Methodological tools, ideal type or pure type of generic phenomena. Uh, an ideal type is a mental construct thought picture that focuses on and expresses the primary elements of a given phenomenon to help categorize it for use in social sciences. So the definitions here are used to outline the minimum conditions of the concepts themselves in a generic form. Generic forms exist as tools for measuring these basic standards by which a person or movement might meet them. However, no movement or person who fits the criteria will merely express the essential elements, but also accidental ones. It is then up to the researcher to discern which conditions are essential and which are accidental. Methodological empathy. To understand an ideology through its members by attempting to peer into the minds, or rather words, of those who experience them as a living and guiding influence on their actions and understandings of the world. This is to help us make sense and evaluate the core values, primary and essential beliefs, political diagnoses, prescriptions about what is right and wrong in the existing world, and ultimate goals, ideal society, utopia, by listening to the believers themselves. However, empathy here does not mean or imply sympathy or apologies. This also doesn't mean we're removing their beliefs from their historic context, given that's also important to understanding those people. Political myth, a narrative or story that provides a group with meaning through a geotemporal compass that tells them where they are, where they're going, and where they were, and how to correctly apply those positions currently in a desired direction going forward. This story ultimately provides a person with the tools for how to look back position their feet presently, and then look forward to fire the arrow of time into the future. Okay, so here we go. What is a political ideology? A cosmogenetic form of uniagentic progressivism. Okay, it went forward too much here. Okay, apologies. Okay, what is a cosmogenetic myth? The belief in cosmic birth from a totalizing worldview that has its own history of past, present, and future events. Uniagentic progressivism is the belief in a singular focus of dimensional progression through human agencies and control by a mass movement or individuals that push towards social and moral health from decadence. So the term decadence here is going to be used in a more general, broad form. So decadence merely means, or degeneration merely means, to move society toward moral and social decay. Now, how you evaluate that decay is dependent upon your own values. So, for example, someone who is pro queer rights would say that the persecution and uh, harming of gay people is degenerate because it lessens positive values in that society. Whereas someone who is against queer people would say that the existence of queer people is degenerate because it's undermining uh, heteronormative values. So again, we're using it in a more generic sense here. So when we take cosmogenetic myth and uniagentic progressivism together into a synthesis, this means that cosmology is filled with an ideological core that provides a story, political myth, that acts as a geotemporal narrative to provide the universe and actions within it with purpose and meaning, to progress the universe or merely earthly time by unidimensional agencies, uniagentic, focused into either a mass movement or separate individual actors to transform the existing conditions toward an ideal development of them. So, the point of putting ideal development is that when people think of utopia, they think of this sort of static future where nothing happens. Being more thinks of it in the sense of an ideal where society and the progression of time is set by ideal conditions. So things still move forward. There's not static, but things are allowed to progress forward uninhibited by undesirable elements or traits. All right.
Another way to phrase it is that the ideals or whatever values that the given political ideology has are actualized into reality. That whatever goals that they seek are put into the very practice of the very social functions by which society has.
Right. So presumably, if, for example, we talk about, and we'll get more into this, if we talk about like Nazi Germany, its whole thousand-year Reich thing, the point of that was not thousands of years, a thousand year of thousands year. I don't know what is wrong with being today. The point of that is, it's not saying that for 1,000 years things will be exactly the same, but that there'll be 1,000 years of uninhibited, full expressive dynamism of the quote unquote Aryan stock, essentially. So communism is not, the free production of producers just sort of stand around and do nothing, but rather they develop free production uninhibited by, capitalism and other things. And we'll get more into that as we get to those ideologies. So we should probably expand cosmogenetic progressivism. So cosmogenetic progressivism is the more shortened expression of the definition. The term political ideology here refers to a modern political phenomenon that is generically non-religious because it concerns the primacy of human agencies as necessary to move history. While religion can and often does intersect with manifestations of political ideology, its focus is on supernatural agency. So the way we're conceptualizing political ideology and religious ideology is concerning how people view the primacy of agency. So in religions, it's conceived that there are supernatural forces that intervene and help to guide humanity, where in political ideology, the movement of history and time is focused directly on the people themselves rather than the supernatural forces. Now, of course, this binary isn't so clear cut when we get into concepts like the politicization of religion and stuff like that. The use of cosmogenetic signifies the nature of political ideology as a form of cosmology, or worldview construction that resides within human consciousness. The prefix uni in uniagentic refers to the idea that human agencies are being unified through a singular and unison dimension of action. So the idea is that you have this core political narrative that tells you about history, where you go, where else to go, and that needs to be fused with this focused and singular drive of human uh, action and expression through it to move that story forward into reality. The use of progressivism signifies the common belief that those with political ideologies have about themselves in relation to their movements, that they are on or under the perception of knowing the correct way forward temporally, either by correcting the existing time or by paving the way for a new time. The former is exhibiting reformism and conformism, while the latter exhibits revolutionism. The common subject in political ideology is humanity. So, humanity has yet to recognize other sentient alien species, right? So, while being has political ideology, the rest of humanity has yet to catch up. So, for the sake of this, we'll say the common subject is humanity. But if of course, if there were aliens that came down and they were like, "Yo, we have political ideology too," then you got to kind of rework that. Um, the belief in a united humanity or divided humanity is accidental, as our focus is on non-human subjects or entities such as nature, animals, robots, extraterrestrial entities like being, and the supernatural. Again, the primacy of agency is on humans, although you can mix in other sorts of stuff as well. Okay. Taxon of political zoology. Um, so being sort of categorizes a lot of political ideology off of sort of zoological classification to try to help people to understand um, the broadening and exclusivity of certain subjects and things like that. So, family ideologies with thin-centered morphologies that are transpositional, running across the political spectrum. Examples: nationalism, populism, feminism, and environmentalism. So, populism can be national, it can be non-national, it can be on the left, and it can be on the right. The point is, it's so broad that it's able to be used by anyone across the political spectrum. The similar thing happens with nationalism. There's in academia, there's recognition of right-wing nationalism, and there's a recognition of left-wing nationalism. Whereas genus ideologies with thick-centered morphologies, which are cispositional. Yeah. So people are going to be confused with the whole transpositional, cispositional. So cis, the prefix literally means on the side of. So there's really no other better prefix than cis. So, um, so thick-centered ideologies are going to be ones that fit on just one side of the political spectrum, and they can't kind of go across. So, for example, liberalism, and we'll show directly that the ideological spectrum that being's created later. So, like liberalism and conservatism tend to be more in the center, whereas socialism tends to be on the far left, or is on the far left, and fascism on the far right. I know that there's arguments within fascist circles like, oh, we're actually third position, but Being would argue that actually you're far right. Subgenus, major morphological tendencies that form around a grouping of species. This is to illustrate the common diverging directions within a species' manifestation of a genera. Examples: radical liberalism, illiberal conservatism, vertical socialism, and cultural fascism. There's a graphic later on to try to explain the difference between a genus, subgenus, and species, because I know a lot of this can get very complicated. So Being doesn't fault anybody for not getting this immediately. Species, a permutation of political ideology, i.e., minor variations of a generis manifestation. For example, social liberalism, paternalistic conservatism, Leninism, Nazism. Okay, so a morphology, by the way, is in the ways in which something can form and shape itself. So The constant is going to be the core. So, for example, liberalism will have a restrictive core, but the ways in which it can manifest are going to come out through individual expression. So, when somebody says they're liberal, they tend to express also the country where they are. So they'll say like, "I'm a Canadian liberal," and so that'll be an accidental, and that'll add on to things. And so, yeah. And then a subgenus is supposed to be common major trends within the genera. So, for example, um, we'll have a grouping of species within liberalism, for example, and we will group many of those species into one subgenus and another subgenus by the common directions in which they're going to go. And we'll get directly more into the subgenuses of the ideologies uh, very soon. So while species yellow and species blue are both part of this genus, they within the genus's morphology tend to follow major trends within that morphology, and so that's why they're both in different subgenuses. Did you want to say anything alternative tomorrow?
Yeah. This also would highlight the fact that many political ideologies, you have internal disputes that happen, and so when, especially within the case of liberalism, when one type of liberal disagrees with another, this is a matter within the confines of like that internal core as to general things that they already agree with versus that one is either not a liberal or is a liberal. And so you have certain perspectives that have higher standards as to how they want to define the general core of that political ideology, and will in some cases exclude others from their perspective as being liberals because they feel as though that these are the requirements needed in order to actualize that the ideological core. So no one should be surprised when if like a classical liberal doesn't necessarily agree with like a liberal who believes in welfare or big government.
Right, because variations are going to happen in concerning how to best deal with the problem. So, a social liberal will say, "Well, the best way to express liberalism is through having government intervention," and a classical liberal will say, "Actually, that actually ruins liberal values and actually gets in the way with them." So, there's going to be those like internal debates. Okay, political positioning. Instead of a political spectrum or compass, we will map the Four-Genera along an ideological spectrum with three mythic bases that correspond to egalitarian leftism, semi-egalitarian centrism, and inegalitarian rightism, malleability. Uh, Unpacked, three mythic bases, general forms of social organization. So those are egalitarian, refers to inclusion and interactivity between humanity. Semi-egalitarian refers to a mixture of inclusion, exclusion, and interactivity and fragmentation. Inegalitarian refers to exclusion and fragmentation between humanity. And malleability generally refers to political change through human agency. The ways political actors engage in shaping the world towards their ideology's ascendancy over time and space rests along a spectrum between the complete division of humanity on one side and the complete intersection of humanity on the other. Okay. All right. And we'll get in directly what the Four-Genera is. There's supposed to be a slide. I think it's net actually no wait, it was before. So Bing's argument is that the four major political ideologies, with the four major thick-centered political ideologies, are socialism, liberalism, conservatism, and fascism. Within those are they both have two subgeneras, and so I mapped them along this conception of a spectrum. And so the far left will make up horizontal socialism, vertical socialism, and radical liberalism. In the center, we have centrist liberalism and liberalized or liberal conservatism. In the far right, we have illiberal conservatism and cultural and racial fascism. And being put, what you'll notice is that the subgenera will end in "ized" to signify its mapping along a spectrum. As we get into specific slides, it'll just sort of say like Instead of liberalized conservatism, it'll just say sort of liberal conservatism. All right. So a brief history on the four major genera of modern politics. A series of major conflicts from roughly the 18th century with the 80 Years' War to the 19th century with the Napoleonic Wars led to a fundamental multi-century transformation of human consciousness. Earthly change left the domain of dynastic rulers and godly forces and entered the domain of the masses. By the time of Napoleon's final defeat, it was fully normalized to perceive grand changes in organized reality, such as institutions, governments, and norms, as now in the hands of the secular and common. During the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution in the 17th century, in the midst of the multi-century transformation, liberalism was fully formed, the first political ideology of the Four-Genera. Not long after, during the collapse of Whig hegemony in British governance in the mid-18th century, the second political ideology of the Four-Genera, Conservatism, fully arrived. So that by the French Revolution and Napoleon's rise to power, two political ideologies, the political left and right, have already established themselves. The early 19th century's portion of the Industrial Revolution saw the awakening of the third ideology of the Four-Genera, Socialism. This would create an out of balance of sorts where you had revolutionary leftism without revolutionary rightism. That is until the post-World War II climate of early 20th century Europe, when fascism would come marching in, our fourth political ideology of the Four-Generas. All right. Now we're going to get into specifically the definitions for the political ideologies. Okay. Liberalism is a homogenetic form of enlightened contractualism. Key concepts: homogenetic myth, the belief that everyone, or at least those deemed legitimate members within a society, should experience the same birth. Enlightened contractualism, the belief in creating greater liberty and knowledge through contractual relations. These synthesized together, humanity can only be born the same under the establishment of a socially contracted society built on the legitimation of human reasoning and popular sovereignty, which provides all of its citizens with their natural rights. Expanded. Homogenetic contractualism expanded. Democracy isn't inherent to liberalism or centrist or radical liberalism, and a one party liberal authoritarian state is theoretically permissible within the parameters of this definition. Centrist liberals will often discount radical liberals as socialists from the liberal canon. The concept of same birth signifies the importance of natural rights and citizenship, but not heterogeneous society. Multicultural, queer, women's POC acceptance has become synonymous with modern liberalism, but early liberal states had very limited franchise and rights. In fact, a lot of early states were questionable regarding democracy. They were often semi-democracies or what is sometimes called liberal autocracies. Liberalism can be both supportive of capitalism and highly critical of its symptoms of disenchantment. So then the general goal behind liberal reformism is to try and reduce capitalism's side effects of hopelessness and degradation of human life. So liberalism will often recognize that capitalism is, say, important for expressing its values, but they will also recognize that it can be abused and there be certain excesses of the system that they could try to fix so that the system better represents their values.
The importance of especially highlighting this is how oftentimes, like, we mistake the people who are critical of capitalism symptoms and its obvious problems as somehow being socialists, when in reality everyone from every Four-Genera is in some way critical of capitalism, or one whether basically either in reforming it to overcome basically the worst side effects of it, or simply wanting to get rid of it. In the case of liberals, they seek to more or less be critical of capitalism, at least the ones that are, in order to more or less overcome the symptoms by which, as already listed off, lead to the degradation of human life and happiness. And so these wouldn't be socialists, but rather just liberals who are critical of capitalism.
Right. Being as a few liberal quotes, As mankind becomes more liberal, they will be more apt to allow that those who conduct the StreamYard logo just blocking out some of the quote. Thank you, StreamYard. That those who conduct themselves as worthy members of the community are equally entitled to the protection of civil government. I hope ever to see America among the foremost nations and examples of justice and liberality, and I presume that your fellow citizens will not forget the patriotic part which you took in the accomplishment of their revolution and the establishment of their government, or the important assistance which they received from a nation in which the Roman Catholic faith is professed. George Washington, letter to Roman Catholics. So Washington is expressing the idea that the creation of civil government, a government that guarantees a common sense of rights and universalism to all those deemed legitimate members. This sameness will then progress forward, and so people will then gain more and more rights, more and more. There'll be more justice, and there'll be more and more human flourishing and prosperity amongst the population of the country. Of course, the irony to a lot of this is that Washington was a massive slave owner, and so it's a good reminder that the subject of the liberal citizen, when they talk about universal rights are only in accordance with those deemed legitimate members of the society. So universal rights does not tend to mean literally everybody, but those only deemed legitimate. So often citizens, so therefore immigrants are going to be considered non-legitimate, and so they're going to be persecuted, crushed. All sorts of things will happen to them because they won't be considered part of that universality. Here's another quote. It has been said that terror is the principle of despotic government. Does your government therefore resemble despotism? Yes. As the sword that gleams in the hands of the heroes of liberty resembles that with which the henchmen of tyranny are armed. Let the despot govern by terror his brutalized subjects, he is right as a despot. Subdue by terror the enemies of liberty, and you will be right, as founders of the republic. The government of the revolution is liberty's despotism against tyranny. Is force made only to protect crime, and is the thunderbolt not destined to strike the heads of the proud? So this is a quote from Robespierre, in which he's trying to justify the terror that went on in the French Revolution. He's saying, the violence, the cruelty, in his mind, is justified because it's toward the goal of establishing the liberal society. Tyrants may engage in similar violence, but the argument is that is illegitimate because that violence is trending toward illegitimate structures like dynasties and other such things. Whereas Robespierre is arguing our violence is actually trending toward better prosperity, even if, ironically, a lot of people are not really experiencing it because they're being crushed. So here's one of the two subgenres for liberalism: centrist liberalism. A subgenus of liberalism that focuses on implementing and reinforcing the vital center through fraternalism between a social balancedness of equality and inequality by representatives of all classes, be they elected or imposed. The Commonwealth of Man requires a careful process of mediation between mass will and enlightened elitism and the development of economic and civic homogenesis to be properly achieved. The advancement of enlightened contracts is pursued along a semi-egalitarian development of restricting the popular wills to respect the consent of the propertied class in popular sovereignty. So the idea with centrist liberalism and what it's trying to do is it says in order for there to be actual popular sovereignty, we need to have representations of all the classes and a mediation of those classes' wants and desires. And so in the American government, you will have House of Representatives, and then you'll have the Senate. And the Senate will represent more the interests of the property classes, where the House was supposed to represent more of the common. And the idea was for centrist liberals that there was a distrust of both the elites, but also the masses. And they argued that there needed to be a society that created sort of a center in which both parts of citizenry would be respected. And so that meant creating layers in which the popular will couldn't just take over everything, and theoretically, it also meant that a property minority couldn't also just sort of become authoritarian leaders of a country.
Yeah, and so like another example um would be something such as Herbert Spencer, who we often don't consider to be like a liberal, but in many ways kind of exemplifies that because, especially in terms of how he formulates this whole theory of social Darwinism and everything else, is the idea that, well, that although as societies grow more or less diverse, like people are still the same, that there still exists this kind of vital center, this whole mediator by which kinds of ensures us this kind of minimal protection or security when it comes to government. And so, but everything else kind of existing outside that is to just be left up to the spontaneous organization of society itself. Um, in s- and in so doing, like that, when it comes to certain inequalities that might emerge from this, that those things have to be respected out of the principle that, well, if a government basically seeks to overstep its boundaries and tries to enforce equality, then it undermines the very principles of and liberties of that very society, especially individual liberties, such as the ability and right for people to fail and succeed on their own terms. And from there, it's a liberal kind of arguing that we shouldn't really care about the weak or care about inequalities um, on a liberal basis, rather than some other basis that people misattributed to either conservatism or fascism.
Right. You know, uh, a socially contracted society in which rational individuals can come together to guarantee common rights does not mean that everybody will be equal. It just means that there will be some sort of common set of opportunities in terms of everybody gets freedom of speech, freedom of whatever. But in terms of other things, those can be tampered or restricted. And so you may have freedom of speech, but you don't really necessarily have the freedom to become a billionaire or freedom to become sort of a news reporter. There are just these sort of common sets of rights that everyone is supposed to have, irrespective of how they're born, as long as they're born within the society and deemed a legitimate member. And so within this, there's plenty of room for inequalities, plenty of room for violence, and all sorts of bigotry to come out of. I think it's helpful to remind everybody that in early America, a lot of people like Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, a lot of these people had this idea um, that African Americans and so-called white people could not, like, it was impossible for them to get along. And so there were a lot of ideas of, okay, should we just sort of take this group of people and put them back over where they quote unquote came from, because there's no way that they could ever get along. Or sometimes liberals would argue that the reason why African Americans can't be full citizens is because they're biologically incapable of ever fitting into civic society. And so this is where you get sort of a liberal version of racism, liberal justifications for genocide. Andrew Jackson, for example, was considered kind of considered a radical uh, in his day because he wanted all white property owners. He was very populist. We get more to radicalism, liberalism here in a minute, but at the same time, he helped to forcibly remove Native Americans from their lands and basically signed the death sentence for tons of them. So while the so-called white man in America, he was born the same as the others, and he had opportunities, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. The indigenous population of America, that didn't exist for them. You know, they were not born with those guarantees, and they were often, explicitly told to leave or just sort of outright murdered. You know. Oh, real quick. So examples of some species that would belong in centrist liberalism would be classical liberalism and social liberalism. So classical liberalism is more the argument that needs to be a limitation on government intervention, and that the free market should flow through the limitation of government, and stuff like that. And social liberalism, which is also called more modern liberalism, is the idea that liberalism should be explicitly about social justice and should explicitly be about welfare and protections. So, social liberalism argues that actually this restrained state that doesn't intervene actually prevents people to have that same birth because there is all sorts of inequalities that can exist when people are not allowed to have safety nets. And so social liberals will say a part of guaranteeing same birth is the opportunity for those better opportunities for those through state intervention and making sure that same birth qualifies for anybody irrespective of race or gender and stuff like that. Classical liberals more argue that that kind of intervention actually is grounds to create a despotic government, and they'll argue that actually what you're doing is you're destroying the socially contracted government, and you're creating some sort of authoritarian one, and sort of stuff like that. So, radical liberalism, or the other subgenera of liberalism, that focuses on implementing and reinforcing the vital masses through fraternalism and direct governance and or authoritarian vanguardism to maintain a revitalization of popular sovereignty. The Commonwealth of Man requires a drastic process of enforcing the social wills of the general populace and the development of economic and civic homogeneous to properly achieve it. The advancement of enlightened contracts is pursued through the egalitarian malleability of consolidating the popular will more directly with the popular sovereignty of the state. So, the way you can think of radical liberalism is that it looks at centrist liberalism and says, okay, all these restrictions you're putting between the popular masses and the propertied are corroding same birth, and that popular sovereignty belongs to the popular. Whereas centrist liberals would say, actually, that opens the doors for popular wills to, at any moment, destroy liberalism and not guarantee it. That's why, there has to be those restrictions. Do you want to say something alternative tomorrow?
Yeah, yes. Yeah, because with any contract, especially since we're understanding it in terms of contractual relations, with any contract implies that there is some third party mediating between the two, like people engaging in whatever business that they're dealing with, and so um and so for like the radical liberals, for them, they look at this and say, well, how can you have a contract if the people are not coming at it from equal grounds? And so it still respects the idea of a contractualism and a social contract, that society kind of forges in this vital center, but believes that the vital center is undermined by the inequalities of society, or by the fact that it has no care or respect for the masses, or a number of things by which the masses themselves must kind of be the kind of center by which everything like kind of orients itself around. But it's still within the kind of confines of a mediator in the form of like this third entity. So so to get to be a little bit more concrete, contemporary kind of liberals today will kind of try and argue that, well, we need to kind of mass mobilize in order to save liberal democracy. Um, and so them doing that is not in any way, some kind of thing to overthrow, like, the system. That's them centering basically the legitimacy of many things that they care about on on popular appeal and the masses, in order to kind of like find where the liberal government is legitimate. So in
Right.
that sense, the masses only are still concerned only insofar as that they respect liberal values, or that they basically uphold liberal institutions.
Right. And radical liberals are less tolerant of what we'll talk about later, which is liberal conservatives. So radical liberals tend to see conservatives generally, even liberal ones, as corrosive to the popular sovereignty. And so they'll tend to advocate for removing them and sort of excising them from society. Whereas centrist liberalism will be tolerant of liberalized conservatives. So the two species we have here that we'll use as examples is Jacobinism or Jacobinism. I don't know why I said Jacobin. And Bonapartism, both of which attempted to sort of create these authoritarian statist governments that were founded directly on representing the mass will and pushing forward directly through it and guaranteeing that the masses were represented directly by an authoritarian figure who could push things further and allow that common birth to prosper. Now, a lot of people say, "Oh, Napoleon Bonaparte." Da, da, da. Well, the thing about Napoleon Bonaparte was the point of creating like the hereditary monarchy was in his mind the idea of guaranteeing common same birth and popular sovereignty, and the argument that the mass wills and their desires need to flow through uh, me and my kin because that hereditary line is justified by the popular revolution. And so while arguably he is recreating, ironically he's recreating the system that he just got rid of, I think the difference is whereas other monarchies try to legitimate themselves with sort of um, supernatural like, oh, God came down and he made me the representative. Napoleon sort of justifies that more along the lines of the popular revolutionaries and God. There's a bit of the God narrative there too, but it's more the popular revolution sit me as the king of the French people. Right.
Because even before this, you also had the existence of constitutional monarchies as a thing by which the liberals, before liberal democracy was a lot more of a popular, like argued for, especially as a more immediate thing in relation to more absolutist monarchies and other kinds of monarchies of like the time. And so it's not out of the picture, especially for Napoleon Bonaparte to to more or less like situate himself as some kind of a line dictator in the sense that, well, because I respect your individual liberties and in liberal values, that my government is therefore legitimate. And that's usually what is often required for liberals to be who they are, or at least any kind of government, as so
Right.
long as it just respects the idea of that the that the individual rights and natural liberties of people are therefore respected. It doesn't matter what the government is, so long as it is. But if it doesn't,
Mm.
then the government should basically be overturned in favor of a liberal one.
Right. And so, as we've argued before, centrist liberalism could also do an authoritarian state where there the single party represents more of a big tent philosophy, wherein within the single party there is like a liberal conservative faction and a more centrist liberal faction that is sort of working together. Whereas with radical liberals, the point of creating an authoritarian government for them is that it's far more exclusively about the radical will of the populace, rather than trying to do sort of this mediation between the classes, or trying to trying to like represent like some side of conservatism in a lot of it. Speaking of, here is conservatism. So the way we're going to define conservatism is that it's a syngenetic form of hierarchical conservationism. Key concepts: syngenetic myth, the belief that everyone within a society, or at least its legitimate members, is born together under developing continuities. Hierarchical conservationism, the belief in the preservation of social stratification. When synthesized, humanity is born together or continuously under the establishment of a customarily constructed society built on the legitimation of ancestral reasoning and institutionalism as preserved by the history of hierarchical constraints. The principal argument in conservatism is that everybody born through this society is born together and in development with the historical continuity of that society. And in order to best preserve those continuities is through hierarchical constraints. Alternative tomorrow. Would you like to also expand on that?
I think you said it pretty well. I can explain late. I can explain other things later as we go on.
All right. Uh, Piper Tompkins, you haven't talked. Would you any comments?
Um, not, not really, not yet.
I love the chair action, some chair ASMR. That's what this video needs. It needs that added chair flavor sound. Love it. All right.
I didn't know my chair was audible.
Syngenetic conservationism expanded. Instead of only looking back or preserving the status quo, conservatives are focused on developing society forward in conformity to historically endowed systemic organizations and cultural norms. Liberal conservatives will often discount illiberal conservatives as reactionaries from the conservative canon. While conservatives do often argue that the social norms they defend are objective, it is possible for them to use cultural relativism and social constructivism to argue for their cultural traditions precisely because of how uniquely invented they are to their own society's history. Anti welfarism isn't inherent to conservatism. Many conservatives throughout history have supported, defended welfare policies. The first modern welfare state, the German Empire, for example, was implemented under Otto von. The welfare policies were implemented under Otto von Bismarck in the 1880s.
So
It's yeah,
so generally the theme here is that with conservatives, um, to put it another way, that when it comes to how society is, that there exists a number of forces outside of more or less like human agency, or at least inmalleable to human agency. And so this can be a number of things depending upon the conservative. So for many religious conservatives, it will be God, or supernatural forces. For other ones, in terms of more secular ways that they're based upon this, it might just be certain kinds of innate human behaviors, or human
well,
psychology, or just or
I
other
think a
parts of
better
human
way.
nature.
I think that just to kind of end, sorry, a better way to understand it is conservatives are thinking not just of present human agency, they're thinking of the human agencies of generations past who have helped in the development of establishing the history of their society. So, religious conservatives are saying what they're talking about more is not merely, oh, this is important because of God's agency, but what they're really talking about is religion is important because of my and the ancestry of my people's historical development with this religion and how much this religion represents our history, our customs, and our way of life. So think about that primacy of agency with conservatism as expanded to all the so the phrase traditionalism is just pure pressure from the dead. Well, conservatism has a pure pressure of agency, but the agency of dead people who belong to their history, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's actually a good way of like phrasing it, because especially like if you take a figure like Meister, there's a famous quote by which he kind of says that even if I was an atheist, him being like a very religious conservative, that even if he was an atheist, he would still basically seek the authority of the Pope by the fact that to him that it's not just the Catholic Church's like entire theology that basically as to merely why he cares for it, but rather the entire history and the way that it's handled itself throughout the the general span of time that basically makes its like authority legitimate, um in a sort of way. So although like to them obviously the kind of more supernatural forces I said before do matter, it's of course in the matter, it's always more specifically in the context of that it provides like agency. That's why you have like probably some of them that would say, well, what would the past generations think of our behavior in conjunction with the present time, to kind of say that that their say so in the past has much of a say now as as it is like ever, because they're the ones that built our society, gave us like the very luxuries or prosperity by which we live under. And so if we can't acknowledge or learn from them, then what are we um other than people who have no way of actually navigating the existing world we live in. And that's usually the mindset by which
Right.
conservatives like undergo when dealing with this.
Exactly. All right. Okay. Some conservative quotes. So the first quote is by an historian on conservatism, and the next quote is a primary. So we have the most self conscious conservatives have always been aware of the constructed character of tradition. They have recognized that conservatives face what Burke called a choice of inheritance. The conservation of the institutional legacy of the past inevitably involves a selection from among existing traditions and legacies. Conservative theory, like all theory, cannot be applied without judgment. Decisions must be made about which historical institutions and traditions are viable under changed circumstances. Decisions as to how inherited institutions and practices ought to be revised or revamped, decisions as to what should be interpreted as the core of institutions to be salvaged as opposed to the chaff which may be discarded. Even among those who regard themselves as conservative, these questions will inevitably elicit a variety of responses. So the way conservatives develop is through figuring out which part of their which part of inherited society. Another way you can understand sort of syngenesis is sort of the concept of our society is legitimated by the collection of developing inheritances and their legacies upon it. And oftentimes conservatives will focus on specifically more inheritances over the other, or they'll argue that um, our society should incorporate monarchy because that will best represent and preserve our cultural way of life and our institutions and our cultural norms. And of course, they're going to be very selective. When people imagine their past, when everybody imagines their past, it's often they will select which interpretation and what elements of those past are important in incorporating present elements and then going forward with those. That's why you have conservatives who will say, okay, democracy is a part of our society, or we need to implement it into our society because it will help preserve our common heritages, our inheritances. And other conservatives will argue, actually, monarchy is best for doing that. So you can have all sorts of innovative new ideas, developments within conservatism, but they have to be legitimated under the grounds that they're historically and hereditably uh, legitimate to the given society.
This is often why it's been hard for many people to even kind of pin down conservatives, especially when, like, with what was just said, can basically take on a multitude of different forms to where, like, two conservatives can basically radically differ on more or less what they think is a historically rooted thing that must more or less be upheld and defended. And some that might even disagree with things that are technically historically rooted in terms of, like, past history. And and so you get a sort of creative way of actually dealing with, like, tradition, by which, like, some traditions are more or less like invented in congruity to other stuff, whereas some are more or less case rejected because they don't reflect whatever certain narrative that they're trying to construct for society. And so an example would be that if you're like an American conservative, and let's say you're like heavily religious, like, um and you would say that, like, well, I think that basically we should have more or less a kind of theocracy within, like, the US, despite the US never at once ever being a theocracy. But how you can legitimate that is by the fact that, well, in past history, that because this society was founded on Christian values and Christians have built this society, that becomes the kind of general narrative by which you invent the justification for a theocracy or some kind of religious guided institution by which should guide America, while also
Right.
rejecting other facets of its history.
Right. Our culture has this inheritance of religion, and that needs to come forward more directly in the governance of that society to preserve and to protect that specific religious inheritance. Here's a quote from Burke. A man full of warm, speculative benevolence may wish his society otherwise constituted than he finds it, but a good patriot and a true politician always considers how he shall make the most of the existing materials of his country. A disposition to preserve and an ability to improve, taken together, would be my standard of a statesman. Everything else is vulgar in the conception, perilous in the execution. Edmund Burke, Reflections on the Revolution in France. All right. Liberal conservatism, a subgenus of conservatism that focuses on implementing and reinforcing the vital contractual agency through paternalism from either voluntary or interventionist forces within liberal society to revitalize tradition. The continuities of man require a careful process of recognizing the reasoning of the dead within the developments of economic and civic syngenesis to be properly achieved. The advancement of hierarchical conservation is conducted through a modest rationalism which is in reverence to sublime forces and developing semi-egalitarian malleability. I'll turn it to Tomorrow. Take it away.
Oh, so well, with this specifically, it's very interesting, especially in congruency with like liberalism, because if you understand how liberalism has kind of set itself as a predominant force throughout Western society, North America, Europe, etc., that in many ways it has many ways become an imperative on the part of many people to contend with it as a political force in of itself. And so many conservatives, from Burke to even the founding fathers of the United States, that for them that um that liberal society is an outgrowth of time tested institutions that have flourished, that have basically flourished and basically brought fruit, like liberalism. That Burke would admit that it was English common law in the ways that British society has handled itself throughout history that has allowed for liberalism to basically be the way it is. And so liberal conservatives, especially in relation to like liberals, would look at liberals as spoiled brats when it comes to how they understand their own history, in saying that, okay, what you're saying is obviously good. It's good that we have liberalism, that we have individual rights, we have all these things, but that's only because that past generations have basically allowed you to have these sort of things. And another example is you would basically, for example, have neocons who would basically tell liberals that, oh, well, the only reason why we're able to have certain liberties is because we basically engage in interventionist action to basically protect ourselves foreignly so that domestically we can be free. And so for you to even eschew or basically be against any type of um like the military and the ways that we handle ourselves foreignly is to basically more or less just allow ourselves to just be attacked or even put all the stuff that we fought for um in peril. And so you basically see this appropriation of liberal values, but basically trying to congeal it within a social paternalism or recognition of a store continuity by which liberalism fits within.
Right. So a liberal conservative would say we too also value contractual relations, elements of the Enlightenment, and homogenesis, but concerning that same birth or concerning those contracts, we need to think about the reasoning of the dead, the contractual relations of the dead, of earlier society, and bringing in the syngenetic developing continuities into the evaluation of the enlightened contracts to temper ourselves and to think, but in reverence to that history. Be modest about the development of liberal society so that it doesn't destroy that which makes up the content of that society. All right. Here we go. All right. Illiberal conservatism, a subgenus of conservatism that focuses on implementing and reinforcing the vital non-contractual agency through paternalism from either voluntary or interventionist forces against liberalism to revitalize illiberal continuities. The continuities of man require a drastic process of recognizing the obedience of the dead within the economic and civil syngenesis to be properly achieved. The advancement of hierarchical conservationism is conducted through a modest reasoning, which is in reverence to sublime forces and developing inegalitarian malleability. So, illiberal conservatives argue that actually enlightened contracts and the sameness are faulty and corrosive to the true reasonings, the true obediences and duties and traditions of society, and that we need to remove liberalism and revitalize those more illiberal histories and those illiberal elements, because those are the part of what actually make up the continuities of our society.
So, while with liberal conservatives who view themselves as trying to appropriate and take control of liberal society, um, illiberal conservatives basically view liberal society as a thing that basically has disrupted the historical continuities um, from past to present and must more or less just be done away with. Um, and so you basically see this especially within societies where liberal beliefs or any type of liberal movement are especially weak, especially outside the Western Europe. You can find this especially within South Europe, Eastern Europe, and many other places, whereby liberalism isn't really a strong political force to contend with, unlike in the West and North America where it is. Um, whereby they would say that, well, we've never dealt with any of these sorts of like ideas of liberties or whatnot, and so these are but foreign pestilences or however they want to phrase it that need to basically be just gotten rid of completely. Or even within the West, that you basically have some people who have seen the entire liberal project as forfeit from the very start or just in general, and would say that, well, liberalism has failed our society in understanding a more deeper history when it comes to the general agency of the past and the wisdom of the past. And so liberalism, either no more or in general, is actually just a mistake that our society has lent itself to by basically forgetting its own past, especially especially if you're like, for example, like a religious one, like a religious conservative, in saying that, like, because of the spread of atheism or secular beliefs or liberalism, that this has more or less been a mistake for our society, has led us to the degeneration that we have today. And so only through reasserting these things, through a radical change of society in terms of reassertion of these traditions, only then can we basically society be saved from the misery that it basically finds itself in because of liberal society. And so when you see these kinds, especially ones that seek, more like a very large change or reform across the general means of society, it's not because of any type of revolutionary purpose, but rather of, in their view, of a reassertion of older historical continuities. And so, in understanding that, it's not for the purpose of creating a new paradigm, but rather to, in their view, to reassert an existing paradigm that liberalism has in many ways disengaged itself with.
Right. And the two examples are authoritarian conservatism. So the conservatism in the 20th century, dictatorships, Franco, Metaxas, Dollfuss. If you want actually video on the Dollfuss and Horthy regimes, which are being argued are authoritarian conservative regimes, there is the Parafascism 2 video. I can link that below. The point of authoritarian conservative regimes was to revitalize traditionalism and illiberal continuities and push away liberal society and try to figure out sort of this third way outside of, or this, I guess, fourth way, however you want to do it. We're not going to do liberal society. We're definitely not going to do socialist society. We're not going to do fascist society. We're going to create a society in which we're going to have a dictatorship, and that dictatorship is going to recognize and pursue traditional conservative interests and those institutions. So you often had, for example, Salazar and Dollfuss would recognize Catholicism in society, although they didn't create theocratic states, they still let the church know that the church was subordinate to their authority. And you also should say Metaxas, who was pro monarchy, pro the religion in Greece as well. But there was also some awkward situations because Metaxas, a lot of the time, wanted to assert the state authority and say, I am the person in charge of preserving these inheritable continuities, and through dictatorial powers, through authoritarian control, I am going to revitalize them. I'm going to incorporate maybe a corporatist economic model or modernization, but the society itself and my dictatorship is founded explicitly on conservatism. Then you have democratic right-wing populism, which being talked about in a recent essay, that being also linked below. And the point of democratic right-wing populism is sort of an illiberal conservatism that is pro-democracy. So instead of doing like authoritarian dictatorships, they actually want democracy, but they want a democracy that represents the quote-unquote native people. They want a proper nation state. The continuities of the native people within the state should be represented. Those who participate in democracy should be part of that native stock. And it sort of imagined itself as a sort of illiberal majoritarianism, whereas authoritarian conservatism tended to imagine itself more in a minoritarian, strictly dictatorial way. Although, of course, authoritarian conservatives would try to adopt sort of that populist image when we talk about like fascistization, which link below. But yeah.
The thing, especially with democratic right-wing populism, is that it's a more contemporary force, especially in the light of the change of political landscape after World War II, where you start seeing the rise of more liberal democracies and the masses becoming more of an imperative on many many political ideologies to contend with, to where if you don't in some way, especially now more than ever, have some sort of mass movement to kind of back your ideas, then you have no hope of ever succeeding and actually making a staple on politics. And and especially with other forces concerning economic crises that have recently happened, along with other things that many conservatives see themselves as that. Well, liberal society has led ourselves to more or less like forget, um, our general nationalism, our general like peoples in terms of like our ethnic makeup, and and uh, and also engage in this sort of kind of internationalism, or as some would call this, cosmopolitanism, that has basically been a way of like undermining our native and uh and cultural like values. And so what is needed is that we need a movement that basically represents um our, us as natives, or the general ethos by which we center ourselves on. So in the United States, it could basically be a number of things like just the general white population, or more broader terms of just Americans as a whole. Just and so this movement more or less needs to kind of seek to undermine liberal democracy or abuse it to some variety to allow us to reassert our reassert more or less like our borders, overcome like the threat of like the other threats that we find to be a threat to just that we find to be an outgrowth of liberalism as a whole. So again, like it's dependent upon the democratic right wing populists and what they kind of understand that to be. So again, it can just be like general like the general internationalism of the economy, the way like the not none of restrictions on more or less like borders, or the change in demographics that basically have happened, or that basically happened throughout history, in terms of some like in the West like arguing that the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant identity is basically being eroded away by the flood of basically other kinds of people, such as South Americans in the United States or other people. And so we need to more or less like go about maintaining that through a populist movement of those people that represent us and seek to uphold that identity.
Yeah, your mic is. Apologize, by the way. Yeah, alternative tomorrow. Your mic keeps kind of. It's funny because like for most of the time you're talking, it's fine, but then every once in a while it'll mess up. So hopefully that won't be too bad. But Bean wants to apologize in advance for those listening. Oh, real quick. Funnily enough, I think we actually
I hope
ignored what's up?
I hope it's fixed now. I'll fix it right now.
Okay. Well, it's only been an hour and 10 minutes. It's good to fix it now, yeah. It's not like we've been going on for a while. Nah, you're okay. It shouldn't be too bad, but yeah. Um I think we forgot Being kind of forgot to really talk about what paternalistic conservatism is. Um so paternalistic conservatism starts around Being wants to starts around in like Otto von Bismarck and more really the one nation conservatism in Britain. Although Bismarck is, people would argue Bismarck represents kind of a different form of liberal conservatism than merely paternalistic conservatism, but that's probably for another day. But anyways, the general idea in paternalistic conservatism is that the classes within society have an obligation, a noble obligation to benefit each other and to help each other. And so paternalistic conservatism or patcons will advocate for social welfarism to reinforce this camaraderie and cohesion, because they'll argue that deregulation, getting rid of welfare, and not having benefits actually destroys that instinct in society for common good. And by having the state come in and provide a sort of net underneath people, it incentivizes people to help each other. And so you had plenty of in about the late 19th century in Europe, you had a lot of cooperative movements that were started by liberals in response to classical liberal policies in places like Austro-Hungary. And so you had like tons of there's a history of liberalism, or sorry, there's a history of conservatives who are super supportive of co-ops, who think co-ops are like awesome and they help improve the ethics of society. Often religious conservatives would say co-ops are great for reinforcing sort of Christian ethics in society, because co-ops taught man to take care of each other and to provide for each other. And so they argued that you needed to have a ton of co-ops in society to actually like reinforce the ethics of Christ. And so I think it's really interesting. I want
The,
also to oh,
I
go
hope
ahead.
I hope I'm clear now. But generally, another thing to highlight is that these paternalistic conservatives often get mistakenly called socialist conservatives or conservative socialists, because of the fact that, well, because they engage in state intervention and everything else, they often either get the mistaken idea, or people mistakenly say that, oh, well, you're a socialist by the fact that you're somehow engaging in state intervention or all these means to kind of remedy social inequalities. But in reality, it's for an entirely different basis, that it's for the purpose of ensuring the stability and the general cohesion of society. Because again, as pointed out before, it's that, well, if the rich don't take care of the of the poor, or at least they're not basically had a leash kept on them, then the poor will basically seek to revolt against them, and and so will just initiate more class struggle against them. And so how you do that is by taking more preventative measures to actually remedy these things. You also see this as well with basically progressive conservatives in the U.S. like Theodore Roosevelt, who also did this for
Oh,
the purpose
you're
of like.
roboting again.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is it clear now?
I yeah, I'll just take so yeah, so patcons are sometimes called like conservative socialists in America. With Theodore Roosevelt and the progressivist movement, they were called progressive conservatives. So another name for patcons is progressive conservatism, and it's essentially the same thing, that classes should take care of each other. There should even be trust busting. Um, Society should, you know, protect the poor. Um, we should crack down on big business so that it doesn't erode a lot of the sort of ethics of society. So it's very Beam would argue they're essentially Beam would argue they're the same thing, but they're kind of called different things. Now, of course, if if a progressive conservative wants to comment below and say, "Being, excuse me, Patcons, we're not the same. You know, we like Theodore Roosevelt. We're naturists. We love the moose." You know, Being would say, "Okay," and that's would be the extent of it. Um, do you want to try again, alternative tomorrow?
Well, one last thing I just wanted to kind of highlight is also that, especially in context of Theodore Roosevelt, that it was also, especially in reply to the socialist movement and the rise of socialism, to also engage in some of these policies that, well, if we kind of engage, like, kind of like release the kind of pressure valve on society to where we just give a certain bit of breadcrumbs to the rest of the masses and the workers and other kinds of things to kind of make it to where they don't have much of a contemporary society anymore, that they might be dissuaded from listening to the socialists by the fact that, hey, well, we gave you uh, a diluted version of kind of what you wanted, but not fully. So why should you go listen to the socialists who haven't been able to do any of that, and then argue that the socialists are useless when it was actually the government and other kinds of things that have actually sought to remedy these like issues. So that's also another reason why in
Right.
relationship to socialists.
Um, for neocons or neoconservatism, Piper, would you like to talk about the neoconservatives? I think you know actually quite a bit about them.
Yeah, sure. So, what in particular?
Oh, sort of what they represent and what they believed and sort of stuff like that.
Um, yeah. So it's a movement that gets its start with a philosopher called Leo Strauss. And he was sort of he was sort of under this impression that what was needed to sort of reunify American society under the sort of national banner of the good and the just and so forth was to create a sort of vanguard, if you will, not necessarily in the Leninist sense, but a vanguard, sort of intellectual vanguard that would um, that would disseminate these sort of heroic myths about American society that the population could rally around to create national unity. Um, and for Strauss, it didn't really matter whether the myths themselves were true. It was more about whether those myths would mobilize the American population towards national unity. It should be said there, I think, that you shouldn't view that as sort of like opportunistic. You should view that actually as a sincere commitment of Strauss's, in the sense that, yeah, he might not, he wasn't necessarily opposed to the use of inaccurate narratives to mobilize people. But the reason he wasn't opposed to that is because he had this larger goal of sort of national, American national unity to, rebuild the heroism of the American nation. Um, and so that priority for him justified the dissemination of sort of national myths that, didn't necessarily have to be completely accurate. Um, and so basically um his sort of brand of conservatism was then picked up by people in the Reagan administration during the Cold War, who would then go on to be part of the Bush administration, and these are the people that became known as the neoconservatives. And since they sort of, really started, they cut their teeth in the Reagan administration during the Cold War, their whole idea was that Reagan was being too soft on the Soviet Union. Reagan needed to galvanize the United States against the Soviet Union and make the United States a force for democracy against the Soviet Union and against communism, which are forces of tyranny, right? And so the United States has to sort of spread American democratic values throughout the world by acting as a real geopolitical force against the evil geopolitical forces like communism, right? That were destructive of those values. And so that sort of comes to its height in the Bush administration with the wars in the Middle East, Iraq and Afghanistan. The people sort of making policy with regard to those wars, driving policy, those were, in the Bush administration, those were the neoconservatives, right? And so these are people who at this point describe themselves as quote unquote democratic revolutionaries, right? So the whole reason, the whole thing, the whole neoconservative ideological justification for the Middle East wars was that by overthrowing evil, undemocratic regimes hostile to the values of the American nation, the United States would fulfill its mission, right, as a purveyor of democracy and good in the world. And thus, it would sort of, you would sort of have national unity around that goal of the spread of democratic revolution across the world, right?
Mhm.
And they were emboldened in this by the fall of the Soviet Union, right? Because the fall of the Soviet Union gave the neoconservatives the impression that the reason that the Soviet Union fell was not because of its own internal issues, right? The actual reason why it fell. It was in fact because the United States had fought the Soviet Union in the Cold War and had won. And so, uh, you know, and so the neoconservatives are then emboldened by that and think they can do something similar in the Middle East. And so then you have the wars in the Middle East, huge numbers of
Would you
people are.
say
Yeah, go ahead.
would you say that with neoconservatives, what makes them interesting is that it's sort of this breed of liberal conservatism, this breed of like American liberal conservatism that asserts that its continuities, its inheritance can be transposed and sort of implemented all over the world to then ensure the safety of those continuities.
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting because just to really quickly, the arch rival of neoconservatism is usually paleoconservatism, which being would argue is a variant of more illiberal conservatism. And paleoconservative arguments in response was actually you can't do that. You can't just sort of transpose uh, continuities all over the world. You have to sort of understand that actually doing that opens them up to be eroded by foreign forces, and that we should actually pursue a more protectionist, isolationist, culturally sort of inclusive uh, strategy to preserve those continuities. And that was sort of the back and forth of a lot of that.
Yeah.
The actual way is that, especially like in the U.S. with American paleocons, is often that they're still more or less dependent on democracy. It's just that everyone else cannot exhibit these things by the fact that to them everyone has their own historical trajectory that they follow, and for us to take it out not only seek to endanger theirs but also ours as well. And so that's the basis by which a lot of them will still kind of defend liberalism, but only within the confines of their own thing, understanding that, well, liberalism is our tradition, but everyone else has theirs.
Well, the thing about paleoconservatives is they're what was called like WASPs, so like white Protestant Christianity, and Bean would argue actually that paleoconservatism represents a form of democratic right wing populism, and a lot of that because it is interesting, right? Because democratic right wing populism sort of takes a perverted version of liberalism and uses that as a lot of its sources for arguing for ostensibly illiberal things, and that's what makes that version of illiberal conservatives so interesting. All right, let's move on to the best ideology, the peak of political thought, really. Socialism. All of us here, we gotta admit our biases. We're all socialists, so just get that out of the way. All right. Socialism is an autogenetic form of social ownershipism. All right. Autogenetic myth, the belief that everyone is or ought to be self-born. Social ownershipism, the belief that society should be organized and managed by this. The belief that society should be organized and managed by the whole membership of society. Okay, synthesized, humanity can only be self-born or self-created through the establishment of an autogenetically conditioned society built on the legitimation of self-direction and the development toward free association. All right. I think I just skipped a slide. No, I didn't. Okay, good. Oops. All right. Okay. Two quotes. One from two primary quotes, basically. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and wherewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and the all springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribed on its banners, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. So we'll talk a bit more about the differences between socialism and communism, but sort of that's Marx talking about how the ideal, the development of socialism is to then achieve a communist society, a free association of free producers. Piper, you're the Marx expert. Is there anything you want to add?
Not at this stage, I don't think.
Well, I can just add that, like, the kind of highlighting thing here, when it comes to especially the autogenetic aspect, is the division between mental and manual labor being abolished. In the idea that, well, there's no division between those who basically go about doing the thinking of society but not the doing, and not the doing but and none of the thinking of society, but rather that everyone thinks and acts for themselves in accordance to their own self direction. And that's the importance, especially within that quote, highlighting the division between mental and physical labor being abolished. Um, just wanted to say that.
Right. Here's the second quote. The proletariat needs the state only temporarily. We do not at all disagree with the anarchists on the question of the abolition of the state as the aim. We maintain that, to achieve this aim, we must temporarily make the use of the instruments, resources, and methods of the state power against the exploiters, just as a temporary dictatorship of the oppressed class is necessary for the abolition of the classes. Vladimir Lenin, State and Revolution. So that quote is talking about Lenin's perception on how to achieve a communist society through the use of an intermediate stage in which there's a transitional state that prepares for it. Now we'll get more into explaining what all that means when we get into the subgeneras. All right. Autogenetic ownershipism expanded. State ownership or intervention in the economy is a standard condition of state affairs and not at all inherent or exclusive to socialism. So the state is not, or socialism is not when the state does stuff, and communism is not when the state does a lot of stuff. You know, the funny, like,
There was
Richard Wolff meme.
well, there's also like There's this clip from years ago where Cenk Uygur is like responding to accusations by conservatives against liberals in the United States, of liberals being like communists or whatever, and he's like, no. See, I'm a socialist, right? Socialism is when like the government owns some industries, like when there's a USPS, a national postal service, you know, or national. I don't think he used the USPS one, but I don't know if he used the healthcare one, but it's an apt one, right? Or a national healthcare service or something like this. Communism is when the government owns every industry. So communism is when the government makes your shoes instead of Nike making your shoes.
The thing to kind of indicate from that, especially if you kind of pick up on the language a little bit, is that well, he's trying to counterpose himself to more or less like heavy state intervention. That his only understanding of socialism is that within the confines of state intervention, and that he only believes in certain levels of state intervention in order to basically make society better. And if you kind of pick up on like everything we learned so far, that would be more indicative of a kind of, especially knowing Jake Huger, more of a kind of radical liberalism that he's emanating rather than simply socialism. Especially by the fact that to him, like that that like he only has an understanding of it, not in the way of like actual self-direction and creating a new paradigm, but that of, oh well, we just make certain forms of regulation. And since socialism and communism have basically been synonymous with that due to the slander basically put upon them, and fear mongering of the Soviet Union, that oh well, I can't help but identify myself with that, but to a more tempered manner.
Of course. Of course. Um. Uh. Okay. Now all I can think about is Jake Huger memes. I'm trying to like focus. Okay. Due to the legacy of the Cold War, yeah. Due to the legacy of the Cold War, horizontal socialism is often discounted or overshadowed in the socialist canon by more vertical socialism. Communism is viewed as the advocation for a form of utopia or idealized society rather than its own separate political ideology here. So, not all socialists are communists, but all non communist socialists still advocate for a form of free association. Uh, Mutualism, for example, advocates for a stateless free association with markets and money. A communist society is an extraterritorial, universal society in which everyone is a producer in free association by engaging in production, distribution, and allocation based on needs and desires. All right. And here we go. Oh, does anyone know what? We have our two socialism. Is there anything to say about communism? How based communism is?
I mean, well,
Communism
I'm
is
certainly
based.
one. Well, I'm certainly one. Yeah, it is based.
Okay, that confirms that that's official record now. Okay. Um, Vertical socialism, a subgenus of socialism that focuses on implementing and reinforcing the vital top through social regimentation to revitalize self-direction. The self-creation of man The self-creation of man requires a careful implementation of the intermediate stage between capitalism and communism through a vertical system of structures in economic and civil society to properly condition humanity towards autogenesis. The advancement of social ownershipism is conducted with the theoretical goal of absolute egalitarian malleability through a period of restrictive top-down management. So, two examples. We have Leninism and then we have Blanchism. I think Piper should explain uh, general vertical socialism and also explain these two examples of species of vertical socialism listed.
Yeah. Okay. So the sort of vertical horizontal distinction is about um, whether long term um, coherent um, uh, social movement organizations, trade union or unions, political parties, etc., so on and so forth, should be directed toward should be organized on a sort of centralized basis with a hierarchical structure and directed toward taking control of the existing, well, I don't want to say existing, taking control of centralized hierarchical institutions like the state, or whether they should be sort of horizontally organized or self-managed, and whether they should be directed towards sort of liquidating the centralized institutions of society. And so the sort of vertical socialism is socialism, or the variety of socialism that sees achieving socialism as a matter of making socialist, creating hierarchically organized socialist organizations, and using those organizations to take control of centralized institutions like the state. The rationale for vertical socialism is it's there's some historical background to the rationale, but we can abstract away from that for a second since there are still vertical socialists around. So the basic rationale is that socialism needs some way to sort of um, uh, defeat its enemies in a complex situation of social struggle. It needs to be able to overcome reactionary forces or anti-socialist forces, um, and thus sort of wield the power of society against those forces. And so the idea is, if you take control of these centralized institutions and your own organizations are centralized, then you can more effectively do battle against the forces seeking to prevent the socialist transformation of society. So that's like the basic sort of rationale behind it. The ultimate goal is that once that sort of battle on the social terrain is won, the need for these sort of centralized organizations and institutions starts to disappear. So you no longer need the state apparatus once the class struggle has been won by the workers and the socialist movement. You no longer need the unions hooked up to the party. You no longer need the political party itself. You no longer need the vanguard of the socialist movement. Instead, all of those centralized organizations can dissolve into social control of production and the free association of the producers. It's interesting. So, like, you can take Lenin for an example, since he's pictured there. In The State and Revolution, he argues that the point of the dictatorship of the proletariat is to prepare the way for every single member of society to participate in its governance. Right. So, and what he means by that is not just like, representative democracy. Oh, you get to vote for somebody that will make decisions on your behalf. What he means by that is that everyone now gets to take part in the decisions that are made in order to govern society. Right. But nevertheless, he defends the need for a sort of workers' state, which he thinks should be on the model of the Paris Commune, in order to defeat the class enemies, basically. So, yeah, I think that's. Oh yeah, and so Leninism and Blanquism. So, and this can get into the historical part a little bit. I'll just explain Blanquism first. and then I'll explain Leninism. Leninism is actually often seen as a form of Blanchism. It's not, and you'll sort of see why as I explain. So basically, Blanchism is a sort of approach to socialist revolution that you get from Auguste Blanqui, who was a socialist in the 19th century French socialist. And yeah, so he's a 19th century French socialist, and his approach towards a socialist revolution is basically, okay, you get like a sort of revolutionary conspiracy together, meaning a small group of revolutionaries, and that small group of people takes control of the state apparatus, right? And then wields it to make socialist transformation, right? And so, okay, that's a really relatively simple idea. And so then we have Leninism, and Leninism is actually much more complicated than that. And in fact, that sort of approach to socialism is something that Leninism rejects. So Leninism, and we sort of have to talk about we'll separate Leninism into two categories: Bolshevism and Marxism-Leninism, because they're not the same thing. So Bolshevism, we'll just use that as the word for, what Lenin and the Bolsheviks believed. Bolshevism was the outgrowth of the Marxist social democratic tradition in Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. That tradition was basically a tradition of Marxist political parties that ran in parliaments and had trade and had unions hooked up to them, and had these big movements with publications and cultural organizations and so on and so forth. And so that movement, its approach to socialist transformation is basically the following. So you have this assumption that what capitalism is doing is through competition, it's centralizing industry in the hands of fewer and fewer capitalists. And that centralization of industry provides the basis for a socialist party to take control of the state apparatus, and thus take control of that concentrated, centralized industry, eliminate the capitalists, eliminate the capitalist market, and start planning production, right? And then eventually, through a kind of process of societal development, that state apparatus dissolves, and you have a sort of direct management of society by its members, right? And that's, communism, the classless society. In the intermediate term, so you can talk in terms of, in terms of minimum and maximum programs, right? So what I just said was the maximum program. The minimum program in the intermediate term for Marxist social democrats was, okay, we got to, because, Europe at this time had undergone modernization, and so you have, representative democracies everywhere in Western Europe. And so the minimum program is to organize a socialist party that will build a mass movement. It will have Marxist intellectuals that educate the working class in scientific socialism. And it will represent the workers in order to achieve workers' rights in parliament. And it will be hooked up to the unions to build the labor movement. And then once that movement achieves critical mass, then you can have the socialist revolution, right? And so Bolshevism basically takes that set of assumptions on board, and was the attempt of Lenin and Trotsky and the rest of the Bolsheviks to implement that Marxist social democracy in Russia. And that is basically what Lenin outlines in his pamphlet, What Is to Be Done. A lot of people, Lenin does have a break with Western European social democracy, but it's not over this basic point of political program. In fact, he breaks with it because he doesn't think that Western European social democracy is actually being faithful to that program. So that's a little bit of a myth about Lenin's relationship to social democracy. And so then you have Marxism-Leninism, okay? And Marxism-Leninism is something that you get sort of post Stalin's takeover of the Soviet Union. And it's basically, what it represents is this sort of approach to it's this sort of program for ruling communist parties that's based on what scholars call high Stalinism in Russia. And so the idea is, okay, you have the Communist Party in power. The state controls production. The state has eliminated class distinctions, and so in virtue of this, it's a state of the workers and peasants. And it carries out economic development to pave the way for the achievement of a communist society, which is a society of extreme or maximal economic abundance. So I lost my train of thought a little bit, but yeah, so that's basically that's Marxism, Leninism, as distinguished from Bolshevism, which is also goes under the name of Leninism. There's also, like, sort of on the periphery, there's like Trotskyism, for example. Trotskyism is sort of another thing. If you want me to go into that, I can, but it's not really that important. The two important things are Bolshevism and Marxism, Leninism.
I can't remember. Did you went over Blanchism, right?
Yes.
Okay.
It was just quick because there's not really much to Blanchism.
Yeah, it felt that's why I forgot. It's like that went by so quickly. All right. Okay. Horizontal socialism, a subgenus of socialism that focuses on implementing and reinforcing the vital bottom through social validity to revitalize self-direction. The self-creation of man requires a drastic procedure of prefiguration to create a direct temporal union between the means of organization and the ends of free association and the implementation of economic and civil autogenesis. The advancement of social ownershipism is conducted through a bottom-up management of egalitarian malleability. So species because it's already a plural, anarcho-communism and mutualism. And so one of the main things about the divide when it comes to permutations of socialism. To sort of reiterate, socialists, when they manifest, will tend to either think of creating forms of organization and management that reflect more closely to the ends of what they're trying to get to, or they will organize and manage things toward a more intermediate stage to help prepare the way for then the more direct goal of free association. And so horizontalist socialists, which everybody here is a horizontalist socialist, anarchist, we will argue that the intermediate stage prevents actually the fulfillment of the direct of the end result, because there is no temporal unity between means and ends, and so there are plenty of opportunities for the assimilation of the system and the withering down of the system into um, not achieving the goal. In a way, when the Soviet government said that they were going to abolish the state, they were kind of correct, only in the sense that the USSR collapsed. So I guess the state really did wither away if you think about it. Anyways, so we have anarcho-communism, and anarcho-communism advocates for this temporal union of means and ends to create a communist society through anarchistic means. Bing has an essay on defining anarchism more specifically. That'll be in the description below. Mutualism believes mutualism is not communist. We're arguing here that mutualist is not a form of non-communist socialism. So again, they want a free association, free producers, but instead of production based on necessarily need and desire, there's also money in markets. I don't know if does Piper. Do you want to kind of explain how that would work real quick?
What, the mutualist version of socialism?
Yeah, well, their version of like how free association would work specifically.
Yeah, so the idea is that you have workers cooperative enterprises, and so these are enterprises that, and they've existed for, hundreds of years, right? So these aren't, this is not a theoretical thing, right? And so you have worker cooperative enterprises where where all the workers who work in an enterprise own that enterprise. Okay. And those enterprises become sort of exhaustive of all of the enterprises that exist within the society, right? And those enterprises have a sort of bank that from which they draw loans with very low interest, and there is then a larger federal structure that facilitates the larger organization of society to be compatible with this cooperative economy, where the different cooperatives are producing, buying and selling, right? And so that federal structure is something that anarcho-communists also advocate, although in a different way. And so that federal structure is basically one where you have regional assemblies of people, all the people in a region come together into a mass assembly. They have, they come to a democratically made decision. They elect a instantly recallable delegate whose job is not to make decisions on their behalf, but to carry out the decisions of the regional assembly in networking with other delegates from other regional assemblies, right? And so that's how the larger society is organized. In a mutualist society, this federal structure organizes society to be compatible with, again, the cooperative market economy.
All right. We can move on, I think, to yes, the last genera.
I think Alternative Tomorrow wanted to say something.
Oh well, yeah. I just also like wanted to say that like, well, to also kind of give I guess like another example of like just horizontal socialism is also like, although I don't agree with this characterization, at least this kind of way of labeling it, it's like like generally the anti-state like the libertarian Marxist tradition or anti-state Marxist tradition that kind of recognizes the issues with top-down management, or more specifically, with the ways how Marxist-Leninists and other kinds of Marxists have carried themselves out by seeking to force themselves upon the masses in such a way as to kind of force them to be free. And so many of them will basically play upon the more horizontal and autogenetic qualities of Marx very much heavily, to in such ways as to kind of argue for forms of Marxism that basically like reflect a more or more one that basically recognizes a more principled means. And so when it comes to like things like Marxist humanism, it's about cultivating and creating a revolutionary philosophy that not only is a reflection of the people's general sentiments, but also helps them to provide a compass by which to kind of go forward. So like unity between theory and practice, as many would put it, or intellectuals and like workers. Some of them more or less like would like believe in other kinds of things, but that's generally like also like another kind of example. But the general like principle lying here is that um, there must be a unity between means and ends for us to achieve like our society. And so for us to at any point like deprive the workers of any type of agency rather than to provide the basis that they cultivate that self-direction on their own is to defeat the whole entire purpose of socialism itself. Because since the purpose is the self-direction, self-creation of people, that if we basically take that out of their hands at any point in time, then we will basically we have failed in what we're doing.
All right. Here we go. Okay, so keep in mind, Bing has like a playlist on fascism, so if you want to know more, Bing already has like a ton of videos. I don't want to get too I don't really want to go too much into this because again, Bing's already like described this ideology so many times. Anyways, fascism, palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism. This is actually the only definition of the Four-Genera that isn't Bing's. This is Roger Griffin's, of course. Key concepts: palingenetic myth, the belief that everyone is or ought to be reborn. Populist ultranationalism, the belief that the organic masses of the nation must mobilize against decadent society. Synthesis: humanity can only be reborn through the establishment of revolutionary ultranational communities legitimated by the national essence and rooted archetypes. All right. Bing's now realizing something. I think the socialist one, the quotes started, and then the expanded started. So, oops. Anyways, palingenetic ultranationalism expanded. Corporatism is not inherent to fascism, as it existed longer than fascism, and is an economic model that can be used by non-fascist governments, as what exhibited in many of the authoritarian conservative governments. You also have sort of tripartite corporatism in like a lot of social democratic Nordic economies. Cultural fascism is often stricken from the fascist canon due to the legacy of Nazi Germany, which overshadowed non-biologically determinate forms of fascism. However, a natural development of all fascist manifestations is racism due to the exclusionism enforced in defining who is and isn't a part of the alternation. So we'll get more into the subgeneras of fascism. Due to the marginalization of fascism in the post-war climate, fascism has often been forced to try and instigate a climate for ultranational awakening rather than to try and create a mass movement now. So a lot of fascism, instead of trying to create like this big mass thing now, they work on sort of creating cultural works to try and climatize or inseminate the idea of more favorable conditions to then work on a mass movement. Um, okay, fascist quotes. There's a quote by Roger Griffin and a quote by Mussolini. In the context of its architectural aesthetic, rooted modernism describes a building unmistakably modern in terms of function and construction techniques, standard of building services, decor, comfort, but whose aesthetics design deliberately invokes or implies a usable past, real or mythic. It is this hybrid of functional modernity with elements of conservatism and tradition, not necessarily the nation's real history, that embodies the ethos of a regime that sees itself as pioneering a new society and opening up a new future for its people, while simultaneously maintaining its continuity with and rootedness in the unique eternal genius of the nation as manifested in its cultural past. So Griffin is sort of talking about the form of modernity, new modernity that fascism wants. He calls it a rooted modernity. We must ruthlessly ruthlessly eject the conservatives, the cowards, the faint-hearted, and the men of yesterday from our ranks and even from our lives. Benito Mussolini. That is from Message from the Ninth Year Speech in Rome, 1930. Mussolini's talking about how, in order to successfully pull off the fascist new order, we must reject those who are trying to reduce it, who are trying to prevent the new fascist man from arising. And so we got to reject conservatism and conservatives. Although it didn't stop Mussolini from making certain concessions to conservatives, although those concessions were very tension filled, and I don't think that those necessarily preclude Mussolini from actually pursuing, in his mind, a sincere desire for a new order, as well as the fact that there were fellow traveling conservatives within the Mussolini regime who thought of fascism as more this means of stability rather than really believing in the core ideology. Okay, so we have cultural fascism. So real quick. Cultural fascism does not mean a culture that is fascist. Just real quick, because this might get misused. Um, a subgenus of fascism that focuses on implementing and reinforcing the vital culture through organic ethicism to reform the superior national community. This rebirth of man requires the cultivation of the national essence in terms of a more generalized but consolidated character and the implementation of its economic and civil palingenesis. The advancement of populist ultranationalism is conducted through a more inclusive but still restrictive transformative vitalism of inegalitarian malleability. So the point of cultural fascism is to say that there are forms of fascists who aren't outright into biological determinism, aren't immediately into genetic supremacism, and who are more comfortable with the idea of having a more inclusive character, even arguably, or as in the case of Salgado's Brazilian integralism, the idea of having the multi races of Brazil come together to create a new Brazilianness, a new national Brazilian essence. Of course, Salgado's union of races did not mean literally every race. If you actually read him, he says that Brazil should fight against cosmopolitanism. So while he was talking about union of races, it was explicitly those races deemed to exhibit Brazilianness or deemed as important in creating the new Brazilian essence. I think a lot of people, when they hear the union of races, they tend to think, "Oh, he wasn't racist or he wasn't bigoted." Arguably, a lot of if Salgado had gotten into power, it's completely conceivable that in the intermixing, because the regime would have celebrated race mixing and seen the country as like a racial laboratory, you still would have seen certain races discounted or people who weren't a part of Brazil as excluded. I mean, there were people in Salgado's regime who were anti Semitic who thought of Jews as inherently cosmopolitan and couldn't possibly be part of the Brazilian makeup. And so that's an example of possibly the Salgado regime in an alternate society where it takes over implementing anti-systemic policies and things like that.
And more than likely,
And the
sorry,
Mhm.
sorry. I just want to say that also there would more than likely be the usage of eugenics throughout most of this in order to basically achieve, like, basically the intermixing of basically all these different races.
all like you could imagine like quotas and stuff, and yeah, I mean it's possible that there was this sort of this stark contrast to Nazi Germany, where it used eugenics and bogus biology and genetics to try to create like a pure race. This could so Gatto's regime could have done that in the direction of trying to foster the new Brazilian essence. Yeah. The other species listed here is fascism. That refers to uppercase fascism, so specifically Mussolini's regime. Mussolini's regime was far less restrictive at first and more inclusive, not as racist as Nazi Germany, although Bean would argue there was still a sense of racism when, if I remember correctly, Mussolini had bigoted views about certain groups of people, as well as when he took over Ethiopia or Libya, he told the people that you need to subordinate yourself to the superior culture of the Italian essence. Uh, and Bean would argue that sort of forcing people to subordinate to a higher culture Bean would argue is a form of bigotry, and no doubt could easily manifest into a form of racism. And of course, as Mussolini's regime went on, it incorporated more racialized policies and was Nazified essentially. Could you, Being needs to check on Steve for about 10 minutes. Would either of you like to go ahead and just kind of fill the air while Being is checking on something?
Oh yeah, sure.
Oh, actually,
Uh,
Piper, sorry, alternative one, but Piper, could you maybe explain um, Griffin's definition, expand on it, why it's better than the Marxist conceptions even?
Okay, well, so yeah, I mean, I can say something about why it's better than the Marxist definitions. So there's two Marxist definitions, right, that have been applied by Marxist scholars and activists since the sort of germination of fascism, um, and or since the fascist era, if you want to say that, say it that way. So one, um, one Marxist definition is the agent theoretic definition, right? Agent theory, it's called. Um, and so agent theory says, okay, fascism is really just like the jackboot of the bourgeoisie, right? So fascism is basically a very extremely coercive vessel for the bourgeoisie to put down um, uh, uh, working class socialist revolutionary movements. The problem with that one, I mean, it really should be obvious, but in case, I mean, there are some leftists who will bandy it about. But the problem with that is you're not actually explaining what makes fascism historically distinctive, right? So fascism is a phenomena that starts between the world wars. Um, it has this unique history in that time and through World War II. It even has a unique history post World War II, describing largely fascists who are not in state power and thus able to repress any social movements. Um, and so, you know, describing it as just a coercive mechanism for the bourgeoisie to repress revolution, the bourgeoisie have since the beginning of capitalist society repressed revolutionary forces, right? So you're not describing anything distinctive about fascism as a historical phenomenon, right? You're not capturing any of this stuff that actually went on between the world wars, through World War II, and then especially after World War II, because again, after World War II, fascism is a movement that has been exiled from power, right? There aren't, despite some people's claims, any fascist movements in power after that, really, right?
Yeah.
Um, so, um, so that's sort of the problem with agent theory. Um, there's the other Marxist definition is Bonapartist theory, the Bonapartist theoretic definition, or Bonapartism. And this sort of, comes from people like Gromsky. It's the sort of more, also Trotsky, and it's sort of the more intellectually sophisticated Marxist way of looking at it. The agent theory version, the agent theory definition is largely a sort of tool of political propaganda by the Soviet Union. Um, so it's not really an intellectually sophisticated idea. The Bonapartist theory is more intellectually sophisticated. It actually tries to analyze what is distinctive about fascism. And so what Bonapartist theory says is that, okay, fascism is a sort of reactionary social movement that gains power within the state with the state's approval in order to suppress revolutionary movements like the agent theory conception. But what differentiates this from the agent theory conception is that after the social movements have been, the revolutionary movements have been repressed and fascism has been invited into state power by the state apparatus, fascism then comes to clash with the state apparatus. It's too militant, it's too extremist for the state apparatus to actually be able to deal with and rule through, right? And so then the state is faced with the task of having to expunge its sort of the fascist forces that it let in power, right? So this version of the Marxist definition, or this Marxist definition, has the advantage of sort of recognizing, to some extent, the agency that fascist movements had, right? And the conflict with the established order that fascist movements were engaged in, to some extent. Not really, not to any, not, it's not recognizing that in a satisfactory way. It's not capturing that satisfactorily, but it's also, it is recognizing it to some extent, right? But the sort of death knell for this definition is that it doesn't recognize that agency enough, right? It doesn't tell you anything. I mean, it's sort of interesting, actually. It tells you that fascism is this force that comes in to state power and gets in conflict with state power, but it doesn't tell you anything about what that force really is, right? And so that makes it seem really generic, right? It doesn't really capture what's distinctive about the nature of fascism, what that specific phenomena was that starts in the interwar period and has sort of existed in different forms up until the present day. So that it shares that problem with the agent theory definition, right? And with the agent theory definition, it also shares the problem, as I said, of not actually recognizing the agency of fascist movements, right? Fascist movements were movements that were against the status quo, right? They weren't just tools of the bourgeoisie, right? They were against the status quo. They wanted an overthrow of the existing, at the time, liberal order. They believed in the revitalization of the nation through a revolutionary nationalist movement. And so agent theory tells you nothing about, what fascists actually desire to do and the reasons that they mobilized thousands of people to create new regimes, to carry out mass murder, to go to war with other countries, etc. Right? And why today, they carry out terrorist attacks, they create online forums, they embed themselves in the music underground, and etc. So really, the sort of like overarching problem with both definitions, although one is more sophisticated than the other, is that they deny that fascists have agency of their own apart from the bourgeoisie, and they don't tell you anything about fascism as a distinctive phenomena. And so Roger Griffin's definition of fascism actually does this, right? Tells you what is distinctive about fascism, what animates fascists, what leads them to do the things that they do, what a fascist social movement is based around, and it also recognizes how fascists have tried to assert their own agency in the social world and to transform society. In addition, these Marxist analyses of fascism tend to make the mistake of suggesting that fascism is a middle-class movement. It's populated mostly by middle-class people. And actual empirical studies of fascist movements have shown that to be false. In fact, these movements tend to be cross-class movements, which sort of actually gels with the sort of fascist nationalism that was designed to transcend class distinctions. Yeah, there you go.
All right, thank you. All right, let's go ahead and move to racial fascism. Alternative tomorrow. Did you want to say anything or?
Yeah. The biggest weakness, especially in terms of more like concrete ways of limitations of the Marxist definition, have basically been their inability to spot and understand the post-war fascists, especially since they've lost like any type of been universally demonized globally, and so any type of ability to actually get any aid from the ruling class or whatever is more or less
Yeah,
been futile.
yeah. Like people, when you tell them, "Oh, what's the new face of fascism?" People will tell you Trump. Nobody knows about Alain Benoit in France. Like possibly one of the most important post-war fascist. Like nobody like even knows that name, and that's like one of the principal theorists behind like ethnopluralism. I mean, that's where it's funny. Richard Spencer's whole "everybody gets an ethnostate" is like a crude uh oversimplification of Benoit's theory. Not to say that Benoit's um theory is like any more legitimate. I'm just saying that like because Benoit describes ethnopluralism as like um each each ethnic and racial difference or the ethnic homogenous differences of all of mankind should sort of separate themselves into these homogenous ethno regions, and he's like, oh, every ethnic difference has its own horizon, and the way Richard Spencer described it was like, yeah, so like everybody gets an ethno state, and it's like a really funny like oversimplification. um but yeah, all right. Racial fascism, a subgenus of fascism that focuses on implementing and reinforcing the vital race through organic ethicism to reform the superior racial community. Organic ethicism, by the way, means sort of the ethics of the organic community. This helps sort of their ethical character, the kind of values that go into their makeup. This all as well for the cultural version, and using this to affirm the superior racial community for the racial fascists. This rebirth of man requires the cultivation of the national essence in terms of a more particularist, consolidated character in the implementation of its economic and civil palingenesis. The advancement of populist ultranationalism is conducted through a more exclusive, biologically determinate vitalism of inegalitarian malleability. So with the Nazis, it wasn't merely just the creation of a new culture, but the advancement of a biologically, genetically pure subject in the new order. Whereas with um, the early stages of Mussolini's fascism or Salgado's fascism, that exclusive biological character isn't focused on, and the new man is more conceptually inclusive. Although arguably, Bean would argue that the consequences of fascism generally in its manifestation, I think, trend towards racism. That would be a critique of the ideology. Ustašism in Croatia also believed in a superior, if I remember correctly, Croatian biological subject, and that the other ethnicities or races in that region should be removed, subordinated, murdered, and stuff like that. All right. I think that definitely covers it. In conclusion, political ideology is a arduous journey of self-reflection by which we go about interpreting the world, not just to understand it, but to also seek to change it. Knowing the basis by which not just you, but how others think and act politically allows you not only to navigate the political landscape effectively, but understand the other political ideologies and how they originate and develop. Thanks for listening. If you have any thoughts and questions and or critiques, feel free to comment below. Insightful Literature, Modernism and Fascism by Roger Griffin, Political Myth by Christopher Flood, and Imagine Communities by Benedict Anderson. Before we get into our closing ad, what final thoughts does Piper Tompkins have?
Yeah, so if you want to understand ideology, what you should do is instead of like, particularly if you want to understand it as a leftist, right? What you should do is not read random stuff written by leftists with no academic qualifications. What you should do is you should read academic literature on the subject. And you don't have to pay for it if you can stand reading PDFs. There are services which I am not recommending for legal reasons, but which do provide PDFs for free. So yeah, read actual academic literature if you want to understand the topic.
Right. Like you shouldn't, for legal purposes, say go to Library Genesis and type in Roger Griffin, and you shouldn't do that because that's illegal. Like you shouldn't type in the nature of fascism. But I mean, I excited for like legal reasons, which you specifically should not do. You shouldn't
Yeah,
go
you should
over
not.
there, get all Griffin's books
Legally,
for
you
free.
shouldn't
You
do
shouldn't
that.
do that. Yeah. You shouldn't do that. We love copyright, private property. Yay. You shouldn't look at Z Library. You shouldn't go to academic articles and look at the DOA or DOI, I think, and put them in the Sci-Hub. That's illegal.
Yeah, don't use
Bad.
Sci-Hub. Never use Sci-Hub.
Yeah, cops are your friend, of course. Never question that. Never always back the blue. All right. So, final thoughts from Alternative Tomorrow.
Yeah, the point of all of this is more specifically in like that, well, you is understanding the political landscape by which you exist in, and so understanding how other belief systems operate like helps you to basically like maneuver around them or just outmaneuver them. So an example would basically be with fascism that when we understand fascism as a coherent political ideology with a certain minimum by which people have to fit into, and the certain modes of motivations that actually drive fascists to actually be who they are, then not only, especially if you're like someone such as a socialist or a leftist, like not only can outmaneuver them, but also understand where they are like today and what they're exactly doing. Because the fascists of today are not like the ones in power, like, seeking to enact like horrible things. And better yet, the fact that we don't consider conservatives or liberals to be genocidal, to be to basically be nationalistic, to be a number of things that we often offload to fascism, actually hurts our ability to actually understand that, like, how dangerous and actually horrible liberals can be, especially talking as like a socialist. And so and so and so you also come to understand that basically people can also enact, certain acts of violence and other kinds of things even without basically the state, because even though the fascists have lost power and basically are more than likely never going to get political power, like any significant political power ever again, they're still going to engage in basically group violence, especially on a small scale. They're still going to basically, commit like lone wolf shootings and a bunch of other things in order to, in their view, in their futile effort to basically enact some kind of race war against like this some perceived race war, of course, against like against basically people that they feel is a threat to their national community. And also, even I'll talk about side that it's just that we have to understand as well, like, how conservatives have their own unique kind of belief system, and how conservatives can exhibit nationalism, exhibit all these things, and in many ways be who they are, despite not only being like symbols of fascism. Same thing with liberals, and it's very sad how a lot of people don't seek to have an adequate way of navigating the political landscape and get blindsided whenever certain things happen because of some misexpectation that they have on the part of like their political opponents to actually be able to basically be able to do X, because since they don't either view sincerity or because they don't understand the relationship that they have towards their goals and other things, that they either more or less can either get backstabbed, basically more or less assimilated into their movement, or a number of things that can happen when they don't understand what are the actual motivations behind these people. And so that's why it's important versus other ways of understanding politics, whether it be in the left wing sense of kind of class reductionism, of only understanding politics in the matter of just purely class, and understanding um, how politics cuts across class lines, and you don't need to basically be a ruling class to basically be a conservative, a fascist, or a liberal, and that and that um and that you have to actually more or less put a lot more agency or stake in actually what you have to actually in your own beliefs and understanding even your own political belief system in order to actually be able to argue it versus just relying on this vague notion that, well, people are going to basically do what I want because of some misperceived notion of what the actual people believe. And I went through like a lot of concepts here, but that's the general thing that I would like to conclude as the importance of why
Right.
like understand political landscape is.
All right. Awesome. I guess the final words before we get to the advertisement. I just want to say that all these ideologies are trying to, in creating their ideal society, are trying to create ideal developments unencumbered by values and ideals they see as preventing those from fully actuating themselves. Liberals want the full expression, the full dynamism of the same birth as collaborated with enlightened contracts to see a utopia of a commonwealth of man where everybody is rational, everybody is guaranteed inalienable rights, and everybody is freely working through contracts, mutual contracts. Conservatives want an ideal society in which the continuities and the development and their historical inheritances are unencumbered by those forces that are not founded on seeing their explicit development fully appreciated and fully immersed. Socialists want the self creation of man to be fully expressed through some form of free association, unencumbered by sort of other forces like the state or capitalism. And fascism, finally, wants the full expression, the full dynamism of their ultranation, their exclusive, organic, healthy members of their society, fully immersed in their rooted archetypes and rootedness in their new order. No ideology is merely looking back or forward or presently. They're simultaneously, like a Janus-headed archer. They are putting their foot down presently in a specific way. They're looking back in a specific way, and then they're looking forward simultaneously in a specific way to fire the arrow into a new time. Liberals and conservatives are more reformist. They're not like revolutionary. They want a new order. They want to kind of perfect, kind of help develop a lot of their existing orders better. Whereas socialists and revolutionary, or socialists and fascists, want explicitly that new order. So they're firing into that new dawn. Of course, we all know that the only true ideology that is based above them all is beingism. Beingism is the best ideology. And with that, we have our ad. This stream was brought to you by Crunchy Ideos, the only ideologically flavored breakfast snack. Try the new Nascent Bowl flavor. Business being. All right. Thank you for joining us, and I hope everyone had a good time.